When an avoidant realizes they destroyed your heart or breaking point of an avoidant partner, there comes a moment when the person who kept running finally looks back, and for the first time they realize what they've broken. Not because you chased them, but because you stopped. When someone with avoidant tendencies realizes they've destroyed your heart, it usually doesn't happen in the heat of conflict. It happens in the quiet, when your absence suddenly echoes louder than your presence ever did. Avoidants don't wake up one day wanting to hurt the people they care about. In fact, many of them truly believe they're protecting both you and themselves by withdrawing. Their distance, their emotional shutdown, their inability to be present when you needed them most. It's not born from cruelty. It's born from fear disguised as independence. But there comes a breaking point, your breaking point. It's the moment when you stop trying to decode their silence, when you stop shrinking yourself to keep them comfortable, when your heart stops negotiating for the bare minimum. And when that happens, something shifts for them. Because avoidants don't respond to pressure, persuasion, or pleas. They respond to consequence, not punishment, consequence. The consequence of losing access to the version of you that tried, that believed, that showed up. When an avoidant realizes they've broken your heart, it's often because you finally stepped away, not to teach them a lesson, but to protect your peace. And suddenly the emotional distance they once needed becomes the very thing they regret. But here's the truth. Their realization is not your responsibility. Their growth is not your job. Their guilt is not your burden to soothe. Your job is to remember that love should not feel like walking on emotional eggshells. It should not require you to mute your needs just to keep someone close. And anyone who truly wants you will work, imperfectly but consistently, to create a space where your heart feels safe. Sometimes an avoidant reaches their moment of clarity too late, but that is not a reflection of your worth. It's simply the result of them discovering in your absence what they couldn't appreciate in your presence. And if they do come back with realization in hand, the question isn't whether they finally get it. The real question is that clarity enough for you now? Because your heart is not something to be understood only after it breaks. It is something to be valued while it beats. Avoidant behavior often looks cold, careless, or even intentionally hurtful from the outside. But at its core, it is rarely born from malice. It is rooted in a deep internal fear. Fear of being overwhelmed, fear of losing autonomy, fear of disappointing someone, fear of being seen too closely, and fear of getting abandoned first. People with avoidant tendencies learned long ago that closeness can feel dangerous. Emotional vulnerability wasn't something they were rewarded for. It was something that made them feel exposed, criticized, or invisible. So instead of reaching out when things get hard, they pull back. Instead of leaning in, they withdraw. Instead of saying, "I'm scared," they say nothing at all. To the partner who loves them, this silence feels personal. It feels like rejection, disrespect, or an inability to care. But what's happening inside the avoidant person is often the opposite. They may care so much that the overwhelming intensity of their feelings frightens them. They don't have the tools to express those emotions safely, so they default to the only strategy they know, distance. This doesn't excuse the pain they cause, but it explains why they behave in ways that seem contradictory. They can want closeness and fear it at the same time. They can love you deeply and still pull away when you try to love them back. They experience connection and threat in the same breath, and because that tension is unbearable, they escape the moment it becomes too real. Avoidants typically learned self-reliance as a form of survival. They became comfortable being alone because it felt safer than relying on anyone who might not show up for them. Independence wasn't simply a preference, it became their shield. So when a partner asks for emotional presence, asks for reassurance, or asks for deeper connection, the avoidant interprets these needs as pressure. Not because the request is unreasonable, but because it activates the hidden fear that they will fail or be consumed. Without emotional awareness, they mistake their discomfort for incompatibility. They believe that pulling back is protecting both people from pain, when in reality, it often creates it. This is why avoidant behavior can be so confusing. They are not trying to punish you. They are not trying to manipulate you. They are trying to stay safe in the only way they know how. But what keeps them safe also keeps them disconnected, and what protects them emotionally ends up hurting the person they care about. That internal conflict is rarely visible to their partner, who sees only the closed doors, the missed cues, the lack of reassurance, and the emotional distance that feels like dismissal. Understanding that their behavior is rooted in fear doesn't negate the impact, it doesn't soften the heartbreak, but it does reveal that the avoidance withdrawal is not a reflection of your value or the depth of your connection. It is a reflection of their internal struggle, one they have never learned to navigate without retreating. The breaking point in a relationship with an avoidant partner rarely happens during an argument or a dramatic moment. It happens quietly, often long after you've tried everything you know to bridge the emotional gap between you. At first, you might explain, reassure, initiate conversations, soften your needs, or give them space in the hope that they'll eventually meet you halfway. You try patience, empathy, and understanding. But with an avoidant partner, these efforts often fall into a void. They don't respond to more effort, they respond to the absence of it. And that realization usually arrives only when you reach a point where you stop fighting for something that isn't fighting for you. This moment, your breaking point, is what creates the shift they were never able to see before. Avoidant individuals tend to move through relationships with a kind of emotional fog. They feel the connection, but keep it at arm's length. They don't always recognize how much you're giving because they've trained themselves not to rely too heavily on anyone. But when you finally stop reaching, that fog begins to lift. Suddenly, the messages they once ignored feel strangely quiet. The emotional safety net they assumed would always be there is gone. The space they thought they wanted doesn't feel spacious anymore. It feels empty. And in that emptiness, they're forced to confront something they've avoided their whole life: emotional consequence. Your breaking point is not you threatening to leave or creating ultimatums. It's the moment you emotionally detach because you've realized you can't keep sacrificing your well-being. You're not slamming doors or sending dramatic texts. You're simply exhausted. You stop explaining why something hurt because it no longer feels like your job to convince someone to care. You stop initiating closeness because you've learned closeness can't be one-sided. You stop waiting for them to notice your needs because waiting has become its own kind of heartbreak. And this is when the avoidant partner often starts to feel the impact. For the first time, they sense a shift in the dynamic they took for granted. You're no longer seeking them out, which means they're no longer in control of the distance. The emotional equilibrium they maintain by pulling back starts to crumble when you stop moving forward. That imbalance creates reflection in a way your words never could. They begin to wonder why you feel different, why communication has changed, why your energy no longer reaches for theirs. The absence of your effort becomes the presence of their awareness. Avoidants don't respond to pressure because pressure triggers their fears, but they respond to consequence because consequence disrupts the illusion that distancing keeps them safe. They may experience guilt, regret, or clarity, sometimes all at once. But the key is that your breaking point didn't aim to teach them anything. It wasn't a strategy, it was self-preservation. The shift that happens in them is triggered by the shift that happens in you. When you stop trying to prove your worth, they finally feel the weight of it. When you stop over-functioning in the relationship, they're left with the space where your effort used to be. That space becomes the truth they can no longer outrun. Avoidant partners often respond to relational pressure by shutting down, not because they don't care, but because pressure activates their deepest fears, fears of losing their autonomy, fears of being emotionally engulfed, or fears of disappointing someone they care about. When they sense that someone wants more from them emotionally than they feel capable of giving, their instinct is to retreat. The more you try to pull them closer, the more they feel the need to create distance. That's why direct confrontation, emotional pleas, or repeated attempts to connect often make them shut down even further. They aren't trying to punish you, they're trying to survive what feels overwhelming. But while pressure closes them off, consequence wakes them up. Consequence is not about manipulation or teaching someone a lesson, it's about reality settling in. When you stop calling, when you stop initiating every conversation, when you stop over-explaining, your feelings, when you're no longer the one smoothing over conflict or carrying the emotional weight of the relationship. This shift creates a new emotional landscape, one where the avoidant partner can no longer depend on you to do all the emotional labor. Without your constant presence and effort, they are forced to look at the relationship as it actually is, not as they've assumed it will always be. The absence of pressure feels safe to an avoidant, but the absence of your energy feels like a loss. They were used to you being the emotional anchor, the person who filled the space when they withdrew, the one who kept the connection alive even when they pulled back. When that stops, the dynamic changes in a way they can no longer ignore. They begin to sense the shift in tone, the lack of reassurance, the subtle emotional withdrawal on your part. They notice when the messages stop coming as often, when your voice sounds more neutral, when your presence no longer feels guaranteed. This is when the internal discomfort begins, not because you've tried harder, but because you finally stopped. What they once perceived as space now feels like distance. What once felt like relief now feels like absence. The silence that used to protect them from vulnerability becomes the silence that exposes what they're losing. Without the pressure they used to fear, they're left with the consequence they never expected, the potential end of connection. Avoidants respond to consequence because it disrupts their internal narrative that they don't need closeness. It forces them to confront the emotional truth they've been avoiding, that losing someone who cared for them is a pain they are not immune to. Sometimes this realization arrives as regret, sometimes as longing, sometimes as confusion. They might begin to question why you've stepped back, why they feel unsettled, why the dynamic feels unfamiliar. They start to notice how much of the relationship depended on your effort and how little they contributed to the emotional bond. This moment of clarity is rarely triggered by your explanations or emotional appeals. It happens because consequence removes the safety net, leaving them face to face with the emptiness their distance created. And for many avoidant partners, that is the first time they truly feel the weight of what they've been pushing away. When an avoidant partner finally realizes the impact of their distance, their withdrawal, or their emotional unavailability, it can bring up a wave of guilt in them. This guilt often shows up as regret, self-blame, or an urgency to reconnect. But even though those feelings may be genuine, they do not become your responsibility to soothe. Too often, people who have been hurt by an avoidant partner feel compelled to comfort them once that guilt appears. You might find yourself wanting to reassure them, to make them feel better, or to soften the truth so they won't spiral. You may even feel empathy for their internal struggle because you've always understood the pain behind their behavior. But it's important to recognize that their realization, even if long overdue, does not obligate you to carry their emotional discomfort. Throughout the relationship, you may have been the one who held space for their fears, adjusted to their boundaries, minimized your needs, or managed the emotional climate to avoid triggering their retreat. When they finally face the consequence of their distancing, it's natural for them to feel overwhelmed or ashamed. But this is a moment that belongs to them, not to you. Their guilt is a direct result of their choices, and allowing them to sit with that feeling is a necessary part of their growth. If you rush to absorb it for them, you recreate the same imbalance that exhausted you in the first place. Avoidant individuals often fear vulnerability so deeply that they unconsciously rely on their partner to maintain emotional stability. When they withdraw, they expect the other person to adapt. When they shut down, they expect understanding. When they avoid difficult conversations, they hope the partner will bridge the gap. This dynamic quietly shifts the emotional work onto one person, while the avoidant remains protected from discomfort. So when the tables turn and they are the ones experiencing discomfort, realizing the hurt they caused, it can be tempting to fall back into the old role of caretaker. But doing so only reinforces the pattern that broke your heart. You are not responsible for easing their conscience about the pain they created. Their feelings of guilt are not a sign that you should return, reassure, or rescue them emotionally. Guilt is simply the emotional feedback of their own behavior becoming clear to them. It is not your role to make it easier to bear. If anything, cushioning their guilt prevents them from fully understanding the impact of their actions. Growth requires discomfort, Accountability requires honesty. Healing requires the willingness to face the truth of one's own patterns. And that process can only occur if you allow them to feel what they feel without stepping in to manage it. Your emotional energy is not a resource they're entitled to just because they finally understand what they've done. You can acknowledge their remorse without carrying it. You can recognize their humanity without minimizing your own wounds. Their guilt may be heavy, but it is theirs to hold. Your responsibility is to your own healing, your own boundaries, and your own emotional clarity, not to the emotional repair of someone who only realized your worth once you were already hurting. When someone with avoidant tendencies finally understands the impact of their actions, it often comes at a moment when the emotional damage has already taken a toll on you. Their realization may sound sincere, heartfelt, or even transformative, but its timing does not erase what you experienced. The fact that they understand only after your heart has been broken does not mean you are obligated to return, reopen yourself, or rebuild what was lost. Your worth was never tied to their ability to recognize it. Their clarity is not proof of your value. It's simply a late acknowledgement of something that was true all along. For so long, you may have been the person who hoped things would change. You probably gave patience, understanding, reassurance, and countless chances because you believed in the potential of the relationship. You saw what the connection could be if they would simply meet you halfway. But despite your effort, their emotional withdrawal created a slow erosion of trust and safety. By the time they finally understand what their distance cost, you've already lived through the loneliness, confusion, and self-doubt their behavior created. And once you've lived that truth, it changes you. Their realization might come packaged with remorse or promises. They may suddenly express things they couldn't say before or show a desire to reconnect. This shift can stir up complicated emotions in you: relief, sadness, hope, resentment, or even a deep longing for the version of the relationship you once imagined. But part of reclaiming your emotional strength is remembering that acknowledgement after the fact does not automatically grant them another chance. You get to decide whether their clarity aligns with what you need now, not what you needed back then. Many people confuse the timing of someone's realization with the importance of the connection. They think they finally understand, so maybe it means something. But late clarity is not a love language. It's not evidence of change. It's simply awareness catching up to the consequences they never expected. Sometimes people don't appreciate emotional stability until it's gone. Sometimes they don't understand your presence until they feel your absence. But that doesn't mean you should go back to a place that cost you your peace just because someone now sees it differently. Your worth does not increase because they now regret losing you. It does not decrease because they couldn't value you sooner. Your worth has always been constant. Their ability to recognize it fluctuated based on their emotional limitations, not your qualities. What matters most is how you feel in this moment. Do you feel safe, seen, supported? Is there newfound understanding enough to repair the distance, or has too much been lost? Those questions are yours to answer, not theirs. Just because someone finally wakes up doesn't mean you must wait for them. Their timing does not dictate your path. You're allowed to move forward, even if they want to move backward. You're allowed to choose yourself, even if they finally choose you. Their realization came when it came, but your healing does not have to pause for their awakening. In the end, the breaking point with an avoidant partner isn't just about the moment they finally understand what their distance has cost. It's about the journey you've taken back to yourself. You spent so much time trying to hold the connection together, trying to love someone who feared the very closeness you offered. And even though their realization may come with sincerity, regret, or a desire to make things right, it doesn't erase the strength you found in choosing yourself. Their clarity doesn't define your value, and their timing doesn't determine your future. What you decide next should come from your own peace, not their awakening. Because love should not require you to shrink, silence your needs, or live in emotional uncertainty. You deserve connection that meets you, matches you, and honors you, not only when it's slipping away, but every day it's present. Whatever you choose moving forward, let it be guided by the truth that your heart deserves safety, reciprocity, and a love that does not wait for loss to recognize your worth. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for giving yourself the space to hear words that may have touched tender places. Your willingness to understand your own heart after everything it has carried is a sign of courage, not weakness. Wherever you are on this journey, I want to honor the strength it took just to be here. Be gentle with yourself as you move forward, and remember, you are worthy of a love that shows up, stays present, and chooses you without hesitation. Take good care of your heart, and thank you for spending this time with me.